You ever have one of those nights where you're deep into some random piece of history and suddenly think, wait, how is this not a Netflix series? That's exactly what happened to me when I first started digging into the scandal-packed lives of some of the most infamous queens in history. And look, I'm not talking about the polite, powdered-faced fairy tale queens who just wave from balconies. No, I mean the women who could stare down an army in the morning, seduce a political rival in the afternoon, and possibly have you accidentally disappear by dinner. The kind of queens who didn't just bend the rules, they threw them into the moat and set them on fire. Tonight, I want you to imagine this. It's late, your phone's in your hand, the room's dim, except for the glow of the screen. Outside, the world is quiet, but in here, I'm about to drag you into the bedrooms, the battlefields, and the whispered rumors of history's most dangerously fascinating women. Some of them ruled with charm, some with steel, and some, well, with a trapdoor under their bed. Yeah, we're going there. Before we jump in, here's the vibe. Grab a drink. I'm partial to something warm. When I'm telling these stories, maybe dim your lights so you can really sink into it. If you've got a fan running in the background, even better. That soft hum, perfect atmosphere for scandal. Because once we start, I promise you're not going to want to pause this. Joanna of Naples, the queen with a trapdoor for lovers now. Let me tell you about Joanna of Naples. Crowned in 1343 and almost instantly decided that royal protocol was just a cute suggestion for other people. I swear, this woman had a knack for treating the throne like her personal stage. Where other royals saw dusty tradition, she saw opportunity. And where other queens were content with one husband at a time, Joanna seemed to collect them like jewelry. 4 marriages. And here's the kicker, her husbands tended not to stick around very long. Her first husband, Andrew of Hungary, didn't even survive their first year together. Officially, he was found hanging from a window in what was labeled an unfortunate accident. Unofficially, let's just say people had questions. And Joanna had none. Now here's where her legend really takes off. And I have to tell you, the first time I read this, I sat back and thought, there's no way, but also this is exactly her energy. The story goes that Joanna had a trap door built beneath her bed. Not for storage. No. For disposal. Picture this, a romantic night in her royal chambers. The candlelight's low, music playing softly in the distance. Then, when the mood's over, or maybe when she simply had enough, the floor under the poor guy gives way, sending him plunging straight into the castle moat. Efficient. Dramatic. And according to some historians, possibly made up by a very bitter ex. Do I believe it? Honestly, yes and no. The thing is, it fits. Joanna had this theatrical streak. She wasn't reckless, she was strategic. People called her charming, people called her dangerous, and I think most people called her both. Usually while slowly backing out of the room. She ruled Naples through wars, papal outrage, political enemies, and honestly more than a few bedroom scandals. She wore her crown the way some people wear a diamond choker, knowing everyone's staring and not caring one bit. And when she finally died strangled, possibly by one of her many enemies, or allies, though I'm using that term loosely, she left behind a legacy that was part political history, part gossip column. In other words, Joanna of Naples wasn't just a queen. She was a living, breathing headline long before headlines existed. And that's just the first queen. If you're already leaning forward in your chair thinking, okay, who's next? Trust me, this is just warming up. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen who flipped the board. Now Joanna was wild, but Eleanor of Aquitaine? She didn't just play the medieval Game of Thrones. She flipped the board, spilled the wine on it, and then wrote a poem about why she was right to do it. This woman was Queen of France, then Queen of England, and mother to 2 future kings. She basically ran the 12th century like it was her personal PR campaign. She married Louis VII of France at 15. He was pious, awkward, and gave off that married his cousin because he had no other hobbies kind of energy. Eleanor, on the other hand, was sharp, rich, and restless, the kind of woman who could walk into a court full of men in armor and have them all nervous laughing in 10 minutes. Louis decided to take her on the Second Crusade, which, for those of you imagining some romantic medieval road trip, nope. Picture weeks of marching through desert heat, sand in your boots, everyone smelling like a wet goat, and your husband ignoring you to cry over relics. Eleanor packed fine clothes, musicians, and this is where things get spicy, may or may not have had a soft spot for her uncle, the Prince of Antioch. People whispered. Louis frowned. Their marriage quietly died somewhere over a cold supper in Damascus. When she got her annulment, Eleanor didn't sulk. She practically sprinted back to Aquitaine and straight into the arms of Henry Plantagenet. He was 11 years younger, red-haired, unpredictable, basically her type. They married, had 10 kids, and made their home one of the most passive-aggressive households in history. But here's the thing about Eleanor, she wasn't just sitting around popping out heirs. She built culture. In her court at Poitiers, she championed courtly love, that overly dramatic medieval I will die without your glance kind of romance. Her court became the go-to spot for nobles who had more passion than impulse control. Think stolen glances, lute music, and a whole lot of bad decisions happening behind tapestries. Then Henry cheated on her a lot, and Eleanor reacted in the most Eleanor way possible. She helped her own sons rebel against him. Imagine Thanksgiving dinner after that. Henry wasn't amused. She ended up under castle arrest for 16 years. And honestly, she used it like a spa retreat. Wrote letters, drank wine, probably plotted half a dozen more rebellions in her head. By the time she was released, she was older, sharper, and still ready to swing the political game in her favor. She lived into her 80s, which is insane for the 12th century, and when she finally died, she left behind a reputation as one of the most brilliant, dangerous, and untouchable women in history. If Joanna of Naples was the headline, Eleanor of Aquitaine was the editorial. Both played the role of queen, but Eleanor, she made sure everyone knew she was the one writing the script. And this is where I start to see a pattern in all of these women. They didn't just survive the political chaos of their time. They thrived in it. Some with charm, some with steel, and some with, a trap door under the bed. Margaret of Burgundy, the queen who fell over pillowcases. Now, Margaret of Burgundy. She's the kind of queen who makes you realize that in medieval Europe, your downfall could come from literally the dumbest detail imaginable. On paper, she ticked every royal box. Proper bloodline, married to the future King of France, looking elegant in fur-trimmed gowns, never openly poisoning anyone at dinner, the works. But in 1314, all of that went up in flames over one scandal that sounds like it was ripped straight from a medieval soap opera. The Tour de Nesle affair. Let me set the scene. Margaret's married to future Louis VI, a man whose charisma, if we're being honest, was about as exciting as boiled cabbage. Their marriage? About as thrilling as watching paint dry on a damp castle wall. Margaret played her role, smiled in public, and probably spent a lot of evenings reading psalms while Louis bored her with talk about tax reforms. Then came the Tour de Nesle, a royal tower right on the Seine. Private. Slightly haunted if you believe the locals. And apparently the perfect spot for some very, let's say, non-psalm-related activities. According to the rumors, Margaret and her sister-in-law Blanche started meeting two very handsome Norman knights in secret there. And here's the thing. They might have gotten away with it if it weren't for the pillowcases. Yes, pillowcases. See, the royal servants started noticing that the knights' luxury linens looked exactly like the ones from the princess's chambers. We're talking identical embroidery, same pattern. That's right, the greatest royal scandal of the decade was blown wide open because someone couldn't keep track of their laundry. When the king's father, Philip IV, found out, the reaction was not subtle. The knights were tortured and executed publicly, dramatically, the whole 9 yards. As for Margaret, she was thrown into Chateau Gaillard, a fortress that was about as warm and cozy as a meat locker. 2 years later, she was dead. Cause? Depends on which account you read. Illness, suffocation, or maybe Louis just wanted a clean slate before becoming king. It's almost darkly funny. In a way, she wasn't accused of treason, witchcraft, or trying to overthrow the kingdom. No, her crime was being too charming in the wrong tower, with the wrong men, on the wrong pillowcases. And in medieval France, that was all it took to erase you from the story. Isabella of France. The queen who invaded her own kingdom. But if Margaret's downfall was small-scale drama, Isabella of France? Hers was a full-blown Netflix political thriller. She marries Edward II of England in 1308. Now, Edward was tall, handsome, but let's just say, his emotional energy wasn't exactly directed toward his wife. From the very start, Isabella was competing for attention with one Piers Gaveston, Edward's closest friend, and some say, more than a friend. Gaveston wasn't just close to the king, he was dripping in gifts, titles, and even outshining Isabella in jewels at her own coronation banquet. Imagine your husband's favorite guy showing up to your wedding reception wearing more sparkle than you. The nobles hated Gaveston. Eventually, they exiled him, recalled him, exiled him again, until finally, they just had him executed. You'd think Isabella might have had a moment of relief, but nope. Edward replaced him with Hugh Despenser, who somehow managed to be even more hated. This guy didn't just have the king's ear, he had his treasury, his council, his lands, and made a hobby of publicly insulting Isabella. Bad move. By 1326, Isabella had had enough. She took her teenage son, the future Edward III, fled to France under the excuse of diplomacy, and there she met Roger Mortimer. Nobleman, rebel, broad shoulders, conveniently single. The two of them cooked up one of the boldest plays in English history, invade England together. And it worked. Edward II was captured and forced to abdicate. Then, while he was imprisoned, he mysteriously died. The official story? Unknown causes. The rumor? A red-hot poker. Most historians think that's probably made up, but with Isabella, you can't entirely rule it out. She ruled as regent alongside Mortimer for a few years, until her son decided he'd had enough of watching them run the kingdom, and share a bed. Mortimer was executed. Isabella was retired, but not in disgrace. She lived out her days comfortably, a woman who had entered England as a wife, and left as a legend who literally conquered her own country. Agnes of Navarre. The charm and the quiet deaths. Now, Agnes of Navarre might not be as famous as Isabella, but in her own court, she was the center of gravity and a source of whispered rumors. She marries James IV of Aragon. Problem: James is already halfway to madness, and not in the fun, artistic, let's write poetry in the moonlight kind of way, more like accusing the curtains of treason kind of way. So Agnes does what a lot of queens in these situations did. She quietly looked elsewhere for affection. Knights, courtiers, musicians, possibly even a monk. She was discreet, but not invisible. And in a castle full of bored servants, secrets had a short shelf life. Soon, people started dying around her. Not in obvious, headline-making ways, just quietly. A rival here, a gossiping maid there. A courtier who accidentally fell into the moat. Was Agnes behind it? Nobody could prove it, but people started locking their spice cabinets when she walked by. When James finally died, and for once, not by her hand, Agnes retired to a convent. Not because she'd found God, but because that's what noble women did to outlive their scandals. She never remarried. Maybe no one was brave enough to ask. And that's the thing with all these women, whether they were guilty, innocent, or somewhere in between. The line between survival and scandal was paper thin. One rumor could crown you. Another could bury you. Joanna of Castile, the queen who slept beside a coffin. So far, we've had trapdoors, pillowcase scandals, full-scale invasions, and suspiciously convenient deaths. But Joanna of Castile? She might take the crown for the most unsettling love story in history. She starts out like a textbook royal success story princess by birth, queen by title, married to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy. And let me tell you that nickname wasn't just flattery. The man was basically medieval Europe's cover model. Flowing blonde hair, perfect calves. That smirk that says, I've never had to pour my own wine. Joanna fell hard. This wasn't some polite political union. This was fire. And for a while, the passion went both ways. But Philip had a fatal flaw. He was severely allergic to monogamy. At first, he kept his affairs subtle. Then, he stopped trying to hide them. Joanna did not take it well. We're talking jealousy turned up to 11. She interrogated him. She raged. There are accounts of her actually pulling other women's hair when she suspected them of catching his eye. And then, the twist. In 1506, Philip dies. Officially, the cause was drinking cold water after a game of ball. Which, come on, even by 16th century standards, that's the kind of excuse you give when you really don't want people to ask more questions. Now here's where Joanna earns her spot on this list and where my modern brain had to pause and just go, wait, what? She doesn't mourn like a normal grieving queen. She keeps the coffin, not just in a royal vault. No, she travels with it, everywhere. She orders it opened repeatedly to make sure no one has stolen the body. She kisses Philip's dead lips. She refuses to let any woman near him, even in death, in case they get ideas. She drags that coffin across Castile like it's a beloved pet, stopping at monasteries along the way, insisting on sleeping next to it. And according to some rumors, though historians tend to get vague here, she may have even done more than just sleep beside it. The chroniclers either didn't want to say it, or didn't want to believe it. Her father eventually declares her insane and locks her away in a convent for the next 46 years. 46. That's a record, even for emotionally intense medieval queens. Now, was she actually mad? Or was this just a grief-stricken woman who couldn't let go of the one man who truly let her down? Historians argue about it. But no matter what the truth is, Joanna is remembered less for her rule and more for her coffin-bound devotion. Catherine the Great, the myth that wouldn't die now. I know Catherine the Great isn't medieval, but she's getting an honorary spot here because when you're talking about queens whose reputations snowballed into outright legend, she's top tier. And first, let's clear this up once and for all. No, she did not die attempting intimacy with a horse. The fact that I even have to say that out loud tells you just how far the gossip machine went in her lifetime and after. Catherine was born a minor German princess, married into Russian royalty, and quickly realized her husband Peter III was not up to the job. He preferred playing with toy soldiers and fawning over Prussia to actually ruling. Or, spending time with his wife. So Catherine did what any ambitious woman in an ice-cold marriage might. She looked elsewhere. She had lovers, many lovers. Officers, nobles, poets, maybe even a furniture maker. She wasn't reckless about it, though. She was strategic. Impress her, and you might walk away with land and a pension. Disappoint her? There's always exile. She overthrew Peter in a coup, ruled Russia brilliantly for decades, modernized the empire, and yet, what's the rumor people remember? The horse. The entirely anatomically impossible horse. Why did that story stick? Because Catherine was powerful, ruled without a man, and in the 18th century, that made people deeply uncomfortable. They couldn't accept her as a competent ruler, so they tried to reduce her to a grotesque joke. In reality, she died of a stroke in bed, no livestock involved. But the myth lived on because scandal always travels faster than truth. Fredegund of Neustria, the queen who slept with a knife. Now let's rewind back to the truly medieval. Fredegund of Neustria wasn't born royal. She started as a servant, but if history has taught us anything, it's that the climb from broom to crown often leaves a suspiciously high body count in its wake. She catches the eye of King Chilperic first. Problem? He already has a wife. Not for long, that wife mysteriously dies. His next wife is found strangled in her bed. Again, Fredegund denies involvement, while holding a pillow. Once she marries Chilperic herself, she goes full force. She keeps a knife under her pillow, literally. Political rival? Poisoned. Bishop insulting her? Dead. Gossiping servant? Disappears. Her feud with her sister-in-law Brunhilde turns into a decades-long murder fest that makes Game of Thrones look like a polite tea party. Even after her husband's own suspicious assassination, she rules as regent for her son, crushes rebellions, and probably adds a few more discreet stabbings to her tally. And somehow, she dies peacefully in bed. I'm telling you, clerical error. Anne Boleyn, the queen who said, "No, Anne Boleyn wasn't born to be queen, she was born to be unforgettable. Sharp-tongued, stylish, magnetic." She walks into Henry VIII's court and suddenly, the king forgets he's already married. But Anne doesn't want to be his mistress. She wants the crown. Henry chases her for years, writes letters that read like teenage diary entries, and breaks with the Catholic Church just to marry her. That's not romance, that's state-sponsored seduction. Once she's queen, Anne doesn't fade into the background. She speaks her mind, teases Henry in public, and generally refuses to play docile. But when she fails to produce a male heir, giving him Elizabeth instead, the tides turn. Rumors swirl. Affairs, incest, witchcraft. Henry's bored, and a bored Henry is a dangerous Henry. She's arrested, given a sham trial, and executed by a French swordsman specially imported for the job. Anne loses her head, but her legacy? Untouchable. She's the queen who dared to say no before she said yes. Christina of Denmark, the queen who dodged a bullet. Christina marries young, is widowed at 16, and suddenly finds herself wealthy, independent, and in the eyes of Europe's monarchs, prime remarriage material. Henry VIII sends for her portrait, and Christina famously replies, "If I had two heads, I would happily put one at the disposal of the King of England." That's not just a rejection, that's a roast. She dodges the Tudor bullet, marries someone far less beheady, and lives a long, comfortable life. Sometimes the most powerful move is knowing when to say, "Hard pass, Maria of Portugal." The mother-in-law from medieval hell now, some queens were dangerous because they ruled armies or toppled kings. Maria of Portugal? She managed to wreak havoc just by being the kind of mother-in-law who could turn a happy marriage into a gothic horror story. She starts her royal career the usual way, reluctantly married to a man twice her age, Alfonso I of Castile. A king with a decent battle record, an ego the size of Toledo, and a mistress he didn't just keep behind closed doors. He flaunted her like a medieval influencer with a side chick. Maria does her duty, gives Alfonso a legitimate heir, the future Peter the Cruel. Leonor, the mistress, she gives him 10 illegitimate children and gets most of the affection, perks, and political influence. When Alfonso dies, Maria finally gets her moment to shine. She returns to Portugal with teenage Peter in tow and becomes the ultimate helicopter parent, the medieval version, which means clinging so hard you could probably hear her nails scraping the crown. Historians politely call it overprotective. Less polite accounts suggest it bordered on obsessive. Peter, of course, falls in love with his longtime mistress Inés de Castro. Maria? Absolutely not. Some say she opposed Inés because of her low nobility. Others hint it was because Maria didn't want to share Peter's loyalty with any woman. And here's where it gets dark. According to some versions, Maria had a hand in Inés's assassination. Whether she orchestrated it or simply allowed it, the result was the same. Inés was dead. Peter's reaction? Pure medieval nightmare fuel. He declares Inés his lawful wife posthumously, digs up her body, dresses her in royal robes, sits her corpse on the throne, and forces the court to kiss her rotting hand. That's not just vengeance, that's performance art and the key of horror. Was Maria truly behind it? We'll never know for sure, but her name stuck in the whispers behind palace curtains for years. In the end, she withdrew from politics, spending her final years writing letters no one read and staring out windows like she was auditioning for a tragic ballad. Olga of Kiev, saint of massacre. Okay, let's shift gears, because now we're in 945 AD, and I'm introducing you to a queen so terrifyingly efficient in revenge that she ended up canonized as a saint. Yes, Saint Olga of Kiev. Her husband, Prince Igor, is murdered by the Drevlians, a neighboring tribe. They make the fatal mistake of assuming she'll mourn quietly and then marry their prince. Olga smiles, nods, and tells them she'll consider it. Then she begins the most methodical, multi-step massacre in history. First, she invites their envoys to her court. While they're still lounging in their boats, her soldiers pick them up, boats and all, and dump them into a massive pit, buried alive. Then she sends word. Send more noble suitors. When they arrive, she offers them a bathhouse to freshen up. Locks the doors, burns it down. Still not done, she heads to the Drevlians' capital and asks for a funeral feast for her husband. They throw a party. She gets them drunk. Her soldiers slaughter 5,000 on the spot. And for her finale? The birds. She demands a tribute of 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from every household. Harmless, right? She ties sulfur-soaked cloth to their legs, lights it, and lets them fly home. The city burns down in one synchronized inferno. And this woman? She later converts to Christianity and becomes Saint Olga. Because apparently sainthood applications in the 10th century didn't have a please list all mass arson events section. Lucrezia Borgia. The beautiful poison rumor. Lucrezia Borgia never wore a queen's crown, but if scandal had a coronation, she'd be sitting on the throne. Born in 1480 to Pope Alexander VI. Yes, Pope, she grew up in a family that treated church rules like a buffet. Take what you like, ignore the rest. She was married off multiple times for political alliances. Husbands tended to either die suddenly, run away, or find themselves in very awkward circumstances. One annulment came with the public explanation that her husband couldn't, perform to her standards. Subtle, the Borgias were not. Rumors swirled that she wore a hollow ring filled with poison, that she had an affair with her brother Cesare, that she gave birth to a child whose paternity was officially listed as unknown, possibly even her father's. Medieval gossip wasn't shy. In reality, Lucrezia was intelligent, fluent in multiple languages, and ran an impressive court in Ferrara later in life. She supported the arts, read poetry, and may have genuinely left her murderous family reputation behind. But the legend of Lucrezia, the beautiful, dangerous poisoner, was too good for history to let go. Wu Zetian, the woman who became emperor. Now let's head to China for one of my favorite power plays in history. Wu Zetian starts as a teenage concubine to Emperor Taizong. When he dies, she's sent to a Buddhist convent like all childless concubines. But Wu, she doesn't stay put. She catches the eye of the next emperor, her former stepson, and comes back to court. From there, she clears rivals with lethal precision, exiling some, framing others, and maybe even smothering her own infant daughter to take down a political enemy. When her husband falls ill, she rules through him. When he dies, she does something no other woman in Chinese history has done. She declares herself emperor in her own right. Not empress, not regent. Emperor. Confucian scholars lose their minds. Rumors explode. Orgies in the palace, secret lovers, golden boxes used for execution. But under her reign, China prospers. Agriculture improves, education expands. The civil service grows. When she dies in her 80s, she's left behind 4 decades of direct rule and a legend as both a brilliant leader and the most feared woman to ever sit the dragon throne. Queen Tamar of Georgia, King of Kings. Queen Tamar of Georgia takes the crown in 1184, but doesn't call herself queen. She calls herself King of Kings, and the thing is, she earns it. Her nobles try to marry her off to someone safe. She picks a drunken Russian prince, marries him, and then promptly exiles him when he misbehaves. After that, she rules alone. Her reign becomes Georgia's golden age. Territory expands, the economy flourishes. Poets can't stop writing about her. One poet in particular, Shota Rustaveli, writes The Knight in the Panther's Skin, an epic romance so intensely devoted to her that modern scholars have questions. Rumors swirl about her private retreats, her close companions, her late-night conversations that didn't involve state policy. Nothing is proven, but the whispers stick. When she dies, she's canonized as a saint, which, given her rumored love life, makes her and Saint Olga the most saints on the list. The medieval Christmas 12 days of controlled chaos. And now, let's talk about how the medieval world celebrated Christmas. Because if you're imagining cozy candlelight and quiet hymns, you're only about 10% right. Christmas lasted 12 days, from December 25th to January 6th. The first day was solemn and holy. But after weeks of Advent fasting, people went hard. Feasting, music, masks, role reversals where peasants played kings, and kings pretended to like it. By January 6th Epiphany, the chaos peaked. A king of the bean was crowned after finding a bean in the 12th night cake. They'd rule the feast, boss people around, and wear a paper crown while everyone pretended this was totally normal. Food? Absurd. Boars' heads paraded in with songs. Roast swans, peacocks in their feathers, pies big enough to hide live birds. Drinks flowed non-stop. Wassail, spiced wine, ale. And at the center of the madness, the lord of misrule, a fool or servant given temporary authority to turn everything upside down. Imagine putting your office intern in charge for 2 weeks, then telling them their main job is to make everyone's life weird. That's the vibe. Saturnalia Rome's week-long permission slip for chaos. So picture this. It's late December in ancient Rome. The days are short, the nights are cold, and the air smells like wood smoke, wine, and whatever questionable street food is roasting nearby. And then, it begins. Saturnalia. This wasn't just a holiday. It was Rome's official press pause on the empire and go feral for a week festival. Shops closed, courts shut down. Even the Senate found ways to conveniently not show up to work. No wars, no official business, just celebration. It started with sacrifices at the Temple of Saturn, the god of agriculture, time, and my personal favorite part, the mythical Golden Age, where there were no rulers, no slaves, just equality and plenty. And Saturnalia was meant to bring that back for a little while. How? By flipping society upside down. Masters served their slaves. Senators wore colorful party robes instead of their stiff white togas. People gambled openly in the streets, sang bawdy songs, and drank wine like it was their patriotic duty. Women told dirty jokes and nobody gasped. And the best part? You could insult anyone, even the emperor, and not get in trouble. It was ritualized anarchy. And at the center of it all was the king of Saturnalia, basically an elected clown, with the power to order people to do ridiculous things. Sometimes chosen by finding a bean in a cake, this temporary monarch could tell you to dance like a donkey or sing poetry to a fruit bowl. And you'd have to do it. The gifts sigillaria, unlike today's lavish gift exchanges, Saturnalia presents were small and often hilarious. We're talking wax or clay figurines, joke items, sweets, candles, and I'm not making this up, phallic charms for good luck. It wasn't about the price tag. It was about the meaning. Candles symbolized light returning after the darkest days. Figurines often poked fun at friends. Kids loved it because for once they could gamble, eat sweets, and boss adults around. The clothes and decor forget stiff Roman fashion. During Saturnalia, everyone wore the synthesis, a colorful, informal robe, and the pileus, a soft cap that symbolized freedom. It was the ancient equivalent of wearing pajamas and a Santa hat to a formal gala. Homes were decorated with greenery, holly, ivy, wreaths, just like we do now. And yes, early Christians were side-eyeing these pagan decorations. Until they started using them too. The sacred roots beneath the party. For all the chaos, Saturnalia wasn't just about blowing off steam. It was a sacred reminder of the Golden Age. By letting slaves sit at the table, by making the rich serve the poor, Rome symbolically returned to a time of equality even if it only lasted a week. When Christianity took hold, the church didn't kill Saturnalia outright. They borrowed from it. Gift-giving, greenery, feasting, and role reversals slipped right into medieval Christmas celebrations. Even our modern holiday chaos owes a little something to those Roman street parties. The sudden stop, and then it ended. The Bean King gave up his crown. Masters reclaimed authority. Slaves went back to work. Saturn's statue in the temple was bound again with wool cords, symbolizing the return to order. It must have been brutal, that shift. Imagine a week where you could mock your boss, skip work, drink at 10 a.m., and then bam, you're back to pretending you're serious and responsible. For Rome, that was the point. It was a pressure valve. You let the chaos out so the system wouldn't explode. From pagan street party to medieval holy day by the Middle Ages, the bones of Saturnalia were still in Europe's winter festivals. The Lord of Misrule in England? Straight out of the Saturnalia King. The gift-giving, still there? The greenery? Yep. Even the rowdy public performances and gambling crept into the holy season. Which is why, even when I'm reading about the most devout medieval Christmas masses, I picture some guy outside the church wearing a paper crown, trying to convince his friends to bet on dice behind the stables. The medieval midwife guardian of life and death. All right, shift gears again. Because if Saturnalia shows us how medieval Europe inherited its chaos, the story of the medieval midwife shows us how it survived its danger. In the 1200s through 1400s, giving birth wasn't just hard, it was deadly. There were no doctors waiting with sterile instruments, no clean hospital beds. You gave birth in your home, a cottage if you were a peasant, a drafty chamber if you were wealthy. And when the contractions started, there was one name everyone called the midwife. She wasn't licensed. She didn't have a degree. She had experience, knowledge passed down from other women, and the calm authority to step into the most dangerous moment of a woman's life and try to bring her through it alive. Her toolkit? Herbs for pain and bleeding. Oil for easing labor. Swaddling cloth soaked in vinegar or wine. A sharp knife for cutting the cord. And sometimes charms, a small carving of Saint Margaret. Iron needles in the bedding to ward off spirits. Whispered prayers to the Virgin Mary. Apprenticeship in blood and breath. Most midwives learned by assisting an older one. First, they prepared the birthing room fire lit, water boiling, linens ready. Then they watched up close as life was pushed into the world. Eventually, they helped, catching the baby, tying the cord, calming the mother. The first solo birth was a trial by fire. If both mother and child lived, she earned the village's trust. If not, suspicion could follow. Because when something went wrong in childbirth, people wanted someone to blame. Between church and suspicion, midwives walked a tightrope. The church needed them. No priest was going to attend a birth, but feared them too. They were often accused of magic, heresy, even witchcraft, especially if they knew herbs that could cause miscarriage or ease labor. Too much. Some dioceses forced them to swear oaths never to use magic or blasphemy. Others interrogated them after stillbirths. Yet, in many villages, they were more trusted than priests because when your wife was screaming through a 36-hour labor, it wasn't the priest's prayers that got the baby out. The birthing room, a women's world. This was one of the only spaces in medieval life where men were excluded. The mother was surrounded by female relatives, friends, neighbors, all under the midwife's command. She directed the process, repositioned the mother, turned a breech baby if she could. If the baby wasn't breathing, she might swing it gently, rub it, breathe into its mouth. If it seemed likely to die before baptism, she would baptize it herself, often with wine, or even spit, because the church taught that unbaptized babies couldn't enter heaven. Her legacy, few midwives left written records. Most died poor, with nothing but their reputation and the skills they'd passed on. But in their hands, generations were born. They were the quiet backbone of survival, walking into rooms where death was waiting, and sometimes walking out with life instead. Back to the thrones, the last of the power players. I know the midwife world feels like a whole different universe from the politics and poison of the royal court. But here's the thing. These two worlds weren't as separate as they seem. Because behind every great king or queen was someone who made sure they survived their own birth. And once they made it to adulthood, surviving their reign was a whole different game. Joanna of Naples might have started a trend. After revisiting that trapdoor queen earlier, I started noticing something. Once one ruler got away with scandal, others seemed to think, why not me? That's how we get to the string of women whose reigns feel like a chain reaction of whispered bedroom stories and public executions. Maria of Portugal. Revisited with the cold, long view. I talked about her earlier, but when you pull back and see the pattern, she's fascinating because her weapon wasn't armies or daggers. It was intimacy and influence over one person, her son. Peter the Cruel may have been feared across Castile, but with Maria in the background, whispering advice, reminding him who his real loyalty should go to. You start to wonder if maybe the puppet master in that story wasn't wearing the crown at all. It's unsettling because it's not loud power. It's not armies marching. It's private rooms, family dinners, careful words, and the kind of love that blurs into possession. Olga of Kiev. The more I think about her, the more unstoppable she feels. I keep coming back to her story because it's the perfect example of how medieval doesn't always mean Europe. You could drop Olga into any time period and she'd terrify people. The planning, the patience, the willingness to escalate without flinching. She's like if every calculated revenge plot you've ever heard of got distilled into one person. And then given sainthood for good measure. Lucrezia Borgia. The art of surviving your own myth. What I love about Lucrezia's story isn't just the poison rumors or the incest gossip, it's how she survived all of it. Because surviving medieval politics was already a high-wire act. Surviving it with the Borgias as your family, that's like crossing that wire in a windstorm while people are throwing knives at you. By the time she's running her court in Ferrara, she's proof that a scandal can either destroy you or turn you into a legend that keeps your name alive for centuries. Wu Zetian, the ultimate rule breaker. When I picture Wu Zetian in her court, I don't imagine her surrounded by scheming eunuchs and terrified ministers. I imagine her sitting there with a half smile, fully aware that everyone is thinking, we can't believe she's actually doing this. Because becoming emperor, not empress, not regent, was unthinkable for a woman in China at that time. And she didn't just take the role, she kept it for decades, every rival gone, every threat neutralized. All while expanding education, agriculture, and the bureaucracy. That's not just ruling. That's building an entire machine around you so no one can take you down. Queen Tamar, what power feels like when you own it with Tamar, it's the confidence that sticks out. Most rulers, especially women in a male-dominated system, had to constantly defend their position. Tamar called herself King of Kings and then backed it up with actual results. Expanded territory, booming economy, poets writing about her like she was divine. The rumors about her private life? Those are just the static around a much bigger signal she was untouchable, and everyone knew it. Why the medieval Christmas was the perfect cover for mischief. Here's why I love ending this section with the Christmas traditions you heard earlier. They're proof that people have always needed a way to turn the rules off for a little while. During those 12 days, you could mess with social hierarchy, drink too much, flirt with the wrong people, wear ridiculous costumes, and it was all part of the tradition. That role reversal wasn't just for fun, it was a safety release. The nobles could laugh off the peasants, mocking them because they knew in a few days the old order would return. The peasants could get away with more than usual because they knew their window was closing. It was mutual and weirdly practical. Saturnalia to the Lord of Misrule. How pagan Rome's party survived in Christian Europe. By now you see the thread. The Lord of Misrule at medieval Christmas. That's just the King of Saturnalia in a new outfit. The gift-giving, straight from Sigillaria. The greenery, same holly and ivy that Romans hung centuries earlier. The church could ban a festival, but banning fun? That's harder. So instead of killing Saturnalia, they rebranded it, slid it into Christmas, sprinkled in some saints, and kept the wine flowing. The midwife as the quiet counterpoint to all this power. After all this chaos, wars, betrayals, poison, public executions, the midwife's world feels small, but it's not. Because she's the one who brings the future rulers into the world. She's also the one who decides in emergencies whether a baby gets baptized in time to save its soul. Think about that. A poor, often illiterate woman in a village could in one night decide something that kings and popes considered eternal. That's power too. It just doesn't get carved into the chronicles. Why these stories stick? I think part of why I can't stop reading about these queens and the midwives and the festivals is because they all show the same thing in different ways. Power isn't always where the history books tell you it is. Sometimes it's in a royal court, with a woman who knows exactly how to turn charm into a weapon. Sometimes it's in a cold birthing room with a woman who has nothing but her hands, her herbs, and her nerve. Sometimes it's in a city square in Rome, where a slave is ordering his master to sing an off-key song in public. Different settings. Same truth. People will always find ways to take control, even if it's just for a night, a week, or a reign. So now that we've wandered through centuries of scandal, survival, ritual, and rebellion, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Because here's what I see. These stories, whether it's Joanna of Naples with her rumored trapdoor, Eleanor of Aquitaine flipping the marital table on two kings, Isabella of France invading her own kingdom, or Wu Zetian crowning herself emperor, they're not just isolated bits of gossip dressed up in historical language. They're proof that the people we think of as distant, the ones in oil paintings, the ones with titles lived in a way that was just as human, chaotic, and strategic as we do now. Every one of these queens had to make impossible choices in a world that didn't want them in power. And they didn't all make them the same way. Some, like Joanna or Lucrezia Borgia, learned to weaponize their reputations leaning into the rumors, or at least letting them swirl without trying too hard to stop them, because fear and fascination could be just as useful as loyalty. Others, like Wu Zetian or Queen Tamar, made themselves untouchable by actually delivering results, building a political machine so strong that it didn't matter who whispered about them behind palace walls. And then there were the ones who made their move by not stepping into the trap at all, like Christina of Denmark, whose refusal to marry Henry VIII was maybe the smartest political act of her life. Sometimes the greatest power isn't in winning the game. It's in walking away before the board flips over. Power in the shadows. But it's not just about the crowns and the thrones. Because in between those royal dramas, you had the midwives, women who never made the headlines but quietly held the fate of entire bloodlines in their hands. They didn't get parades, they didn't get portraits, but they carried a kind of authority that no king could strip from them. When a birth went wrong, it was their skill, not the church, not the court, that decided whether a dynasty continued or ended in that smoky, firelit room. And because their world was mostly invisible to the men writing history, the only way we catch glimpses of it now is through trial records, parish notes, or the occasional surviving oath sworn before a bishop. Which means the real picture is probably even richer, more complicated, and more powerful than what we'll ever know. The need for controlled chaos. And then you have Saturnalia, and its medieval offspring, Christmas with the Lord of Misrule. These weren't just parties. They were built into the structure of the year. Every society needs release valves. Saturnalia gave Rome a sanctioned week to mock the powerful, eat and drink without restraint, and live in a world where the rules were suspended. Medieval Christmas picked up the torch, 12 days where you could turn the social order upside down, sing in the streets, gamble, kiss under mistletoe, and be crowned Bean King for a night. It's easy to look at these festivals as just fun, but they kept the system from cracking. When you can let off pressure in bursts, you make it easier for everyone to go back to the grind without setting the whole thing on fire. The same way a queen might allow a scandal to distract from a political move, a society might allow misrule to protect the deeper order. A pattern across centuries. And here's the thing, when you zoom out far enough, the queens, the midwives, the festivals, they're all connected by one theme: adaptability. Joanna of Naples adapted by making herself untouchable through drama. Eleanor adapted by remarrying and creating a cultural empire in her court. Isabella adapted by allying with Roger Mortimer and taking the throne by force. Wu Zetian adapted by turning the system on its head and claiming the title no woman had dared take before. Midwives adapted every single day by using whatever they had: herbs, oil, charms to keep mothers and babies alive. And entire cities adapted through ritualized chaos like Saturnalia, giving themselves space to breathe without tearing down the whole hierarchy. It's all the same instinct, whether you're holding a crown, a newborn, or a clay figurine from a festival stall. Find the opening, take it, survive another day. Why we still care. I think that's why these stories hit so hard even now. Because while the stakes have changed, the instincts haven't. We're still negotiating our positions in rooms where we might not have the most power. We're still figuring out when to make noise, when to go quiet, and when to let someone else believe they're in charge while we move the real pieces behind the scenes. And maybe that's why the image of Joanna kissing her dead husband's lips, or Olga burning a city with pigeons, or a midwife baptizing a baby with wine stays in your head. It's because it's extreme. But it's also recognizable. You can feel the desperation, the calculation, the risk, the last word. So next time you hear the word queen, and picture nothing but silks, jewels, and a polite wave from a balcony, remember Joanna's trapdoor, Eleanor's rebellion, Isabella's invasion, Wu Zetian's throne. Remember the women whose power wasn't written into law, but into the survival of the people around them, the midwives, the schemers, the ones who turned gossip into armor. And remember that every festival, every role reversal, every bean crown and paper hat had a purpose beyond the laughter. Because history isn't just battles and treaties. It's the quiet hands that kept a dynasty alive, the chaos that kept a society stable, and the women, crowned or not, who knew exactly when to play the part and when to tear up the script.